The phone buzzed insistently in my pocket, pulling me away from my work. I sighed, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and stepped outside the small, makeshift clinic. The bright midday sun cast long shadows across the quiet rural village, making me squint. I pulled the phone out and glanced at the screen. My stomach sank. Richard. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Over the years, my stepfather had only ever brought trouble into my life. Calls from him rarely meant anything good, but a small part of me, a mix of curiosity and stubborn hope, made me answer anyway. "Hello," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Catherine." His tone was far too cheerful, almost smug. "Just thought you'd want to know. I sold the mountain cabin." I froze, gripping the phone tighter. Surely, I had misheard him. "You did what?" I asked, my voice sharp with disbelief. "Sold it," he repeated, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Don't sound so shocked. It was for the greater good, mine, obviously." He laughed, the sound making my blood boil. "My name is Catherine, and for as long as I can remember, Richard has been a thorn in my side. My mother married him when I was 15, and at first, he seemed charming, always full of jokes and good humor, but beneath that friendly mask was a selfish man who always put himself first. The cabin wasn't just some vacation home, it was my sanctuary, nestled deep in the mountains. It was the one place where I could truly relax, away from the stress of my demanding job. I had spent years fixing it up, making it my own. It was where I went after long, exhausting work trips. It was where I gathered with friends for peaceful weekends. It was my safe haven. And now, Richard was telling me he had sold it, as if it were just a piece of furniture he no longer needed. "You had no right," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Relax," he said dismissively. "I've been managing things while you're off saving the world. And let's be honest, what's the point of keeping a place you're never around to enjoy? Selling it was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later." I clenched my jaw. "I'll thank you when hell freezes over." I snapped and ended the call before he could say another word. I paced back and forth, my emotions swirling like a storm inside me. Richard had done plenty of selfish things before, but this was unforgivable. What he didn't know, though, was that he couldn't legally sell the cabin, not without my best friend, Laura. Laura and I had bought the cabin together, and we had a legal agreement stating that neither of us could sell it without the other's signature. Richard must have assumed he could trick or bully his way into selling it, but he was about to learn a hard lesson. Taking a deep breath, I sat down on the small cot inside the clinic, my hands gripping my phone. I needed to call Laura. I tapped on her name and waited. "Hey, Kathy, what's up?" she answered, her voice bright and cheerful. "Richard sold the cabin," I blurted out, unable to keep the anger from my voice. There was a long pause. "He what?" Laura finally said, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Apparently, he needed money to pay off some gambling debts," I said bitterly. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants, but I know for a fact that our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority to sell it without your consent." Laura let out a low whistle. "He really thought he could get away with this? That man has no shame." "None," I agreed. "I need your help to sort this out. I'll finish my assignment here and head back home as soon as I can. Can you pull up the legal documents in the meantime? I want to be ready to fight this." "You got it," Laura said, her voice firm. "We'll take care of this together." As I hung up, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Richard thought he had outsmarted me, that I was too far away to do anything, but he didn't realize that I wasn't the same scared teenager he used to intimidate. I was an adult now, and I wasn't going to let him take away something that meant so much to me. The next few days passed in a blur. I focused on my work at the clinic, trying to push my anger aside, but no matter how busy I kept myself, Richard's betrayal lingered in the back of my mind. At night, when everything was quiet, the memories of the cabin filled my thoughts, the summers the first spent there as a child, chasing fireflies with my mom before she remarried, the nights spent by the fireplace, the long hikes, the feeling of complete peace. This wasn't just a house. It was a part of me. And Richard thought he could just sell it like a cheap trinket? No, not this time. Laura called me again a few days later, her voice brisk and businesslike. "I checked the co-ownership agreement," she said. "You were right, he had no authority to sell without my signature. The sale is invalid." Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by anger. "Do we know who he tried to sell it to?" I asked. Not yet, Laura replied. I checked county records, and there's no official transfer of ownership. It looks like he tried to do this under the table. That sounded exactly like Richard, always looking for shortcuts, always thinking he could cheat his way through life. So what's our next step? I asked. We can either confront him directly or let the legal process handle it. Either way, he's got no legal standing. I let out a deep breath. Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, she said warmly, but I've got your back, always. As I hung up, my mind began to form a plan. I would return home, face Richard, and handle this the right way. No yelling, no anger, that's what he expected. Instead, I'd do something he never saw coming. I'd be smart. I'd use the law, my resources, and my determination to put him in his place. Richard thought he had won. But he was about to learn that he had underestimated me for the last time. I knew he was upset, but I needed him to understand my side of things. Richard, I get that you're in trouble, but you have to see where I'm coming from. You had no right to do this. Richard sighed heavily, running a hand through his messy hair. I was desperate. The people I owe money to, they aren't exactly the kind of people who wait patiently. I raised an eyebrow, crossing my arms. And you thought the best solution was stealing my property? Borrowing, he corrected quickly, as if changing the word would make things better. I was going to make it back. As soon as my luck turned around, I would have repaid you every cent. I let out a bitter laugh. Your luck? That's what you're counting on? Richard, I've known you for years, and gambling has never worked out for you. Why would this time be any different? Richard shifted uncomfortably, but the look of guilt on his face quickly disappeared, replaced by his usual arrogance. You're making a big deal out of nothing. It's just a cabin. You barely even stay there. What's the harm in letting someone else use it? I clenched my jaw, my patience running thin. Because it's mine, Richard, it's my home. You don't get to decide what I do with my property or what it means to me. And for the record, Laura values it just as much as I do. Your so-called sale is invalid, and you know it. His face darkened, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression. Was it fear? You wouldn't actually go to the police, would you? You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that. I stepped closer, meeting his gaze head-on. Try me. For once, Richard had no quick comeback. He stared at me for a second, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out of my house, slamming the door behind him. I took a deep breath, my heart still pounding from the confrontation. Despite the tension, I felt a small spark of satisfaction. Richard was finally realizing that I wasn't going to let him push me around anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about standing up to someone who had taken advantage of me for far too long. After Richard left, I called Laura to update her on what had happened. He showed up here, I said, pacing back and forth in my living room, tried to act like he was just borrowing the cabin to pay off some debts. Laura scoffed. Borrowing? Does he even hear himself? What did you say? I told him the sale was invalid and that if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities. That seemed to shake him up a little, but knowing Richard, he's probably already coming up with another plan. Let him try, Laura said firmly. We have the law on our side. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and we're drafting a cease and desist letter. If he involves the buyer again, we'll have legal documents ready to shut it down. I nodded, her words reassuring me. Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, she said confidently, but don't worry, we're in this together. Over the next few days, I focused on gathering evidence. I pulled together the co-ownership agreement, saved every text message Richard had sent about the so-called sale, and even contacted the real estate agent involved in the deal. When I reached her, she sounded nervous. Look, I didn't know the full situation, she said quickly. Richard told me he had permission to sell the cabin. If I had known you were a co-owner, I never would have gone through with it. Well, now you know, I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. I don't want to drag you into this, but I need your help. Can you confirm that Richard signed the paperwork alone? She hesitated before admitting, yes, the buyer hasn't paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can provide you with the documents if you need them. That would be very helpful, I said, quickly writing down her contact details. As I hung up, my determination grew stronger. Richard had counted on me being too passive, too distant to fight back. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. That evening, Laura called with more news. The letter is ready, she said. We'll send it first thing tomorrow, and if Richard tries anything else, we'll escalate the situation legally. Perfect, I said, a small smile forming. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was in control of the situation. The next morning, Laura and I finalized the cease and desist letter and sent it to Richard. The message was crystal clear: if he tried to claim ownership of the cabin or interfere with the buyer again, there would be serious legal consequences. I imagined his reaction when he received it. He had spent years manipulating people into doing what he wanted, but this time, there was no way out. Later that day, the real estate agent emailed me the sale documents. Seeing Richard's signature on a fraudulent sale agreement made my stomach turn, but it also fueled my resolve. He hadn't just crossed a line, he had completely bulldozed over it. That evening, I received a call from Detective Miller, a local officer Laura had contacted. "Miss Daniels," he said in a professional tone, "I've reviewed the documents you and Miss Langley provided. It's clear that the sale was unauthorized. Based on the evidence, we can move forward with an official investigation if you'd like." I didn't hesitate. "Yes, I want to pursue this." "Understood," he said. "We'll begin by informing the buyer and halting the sale. If Richard continues to interfere, we'll escalate the matter to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation." "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Please let me know if you need anything else." As I hung up, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. This time, Richard wasn't going to get away with it. 2 days later, Detective Miller called again. "Miss Daniels, we've spoken with the buyer, and they've agreed to stop the transaction. They had no idea about the co-ownership agreement and are willing to cooperate." Relief washed over me. "That's amazing news. So the sale is officially void?" "Yes," he confirmed. "Your cabin remains yours and Miss Langley's. However, we'll need to continue the investigation into your stepfather's fraudulent actions. Would you like to press charges?" I paused for only a second before answering. "Yes, I want him to be held accountable." "Understood," the detective said. "We'll proceed with the case." After the call, I exhaled deeply. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. The cabin was safe, and Richard's schemes were finally catching up with him. That evening, Laura and I sat on the porch, overlooking the mountains with a bottle of wine between us. "To standing our ground," she said, raising her glass. "And to not letting anyone push us around," I added. As we clinked glasses, I realized how much I had grown from this ordeal. For years, I had avoided conflict, trying to keep the peace with Richard, but this time, I had stood my ground. And it felt like a turning point, not just in my relationship with him, but in how I saw myself. As the sun set behind the mountains, I breathed in the fresh, pine-scented air. For the first time in a long while, I truly felt at home, not just in the cabin, but in my own life.